big cultural extrapolations. And who doesn't have those? Who doesn't have big claims to make about culture, right? Everyone has a theory about the rise and fall of civilizations. I do also, but I'm not going to be so bold as to say that I can explain that. I'm not like a historian, right? So I'm not going to tell you why civilizations rise and fall, but I'm going to point out a few things, a few observations, and maybe some dynamics that contribute to this. And to the extent they contribute, it's up for you to decide, but I hope I'm persuasive. So, just to set out, have been many civilizations: the Roman Empire, Mediterranean kingdoms other than the Roman Empire, the Mongol Empire, the British Empire, the Ottoman Empire, various caliphates. I mean, there are too many empires to list that have come and gone. Have At one point they were nothing, and then they came and became the greatest civilization on earth, and they were world leaders, or at least leaders in their continent, leaders in their whole hemisphere, and then they after a while degenerated away and they went bust, right? And companies are like this too. A lot of companies, they come and they have their time in the sun and then they go bust. But why is this though? We really take it for granted. Anyone who studies history, they kind of take it for granted that this is just the way of history. This is how every civilization is going to go. Yeah, the Romans, they were pretty good. They almost looked like they could have outlasted them all, but even the Romans, like they had their time in the sun, but they eventually faded away. They became, they degenerated into other empires, right? So it's not obvious to me that this is something we should take for granted, which is to say, it's something that we discover about the world. But if you knew nothing about the world, and all of that you knew is these basic concepts, like the concept of empires and stuff like that, but you didn't know any actual history, it's not obvious that you would conclude based on that civilizations would come and go. Because capital accumulates, right? Like resources accumulate. You can use resources to get more resources, so progress is compounding. So it's conceivable that in some other planet, it's one empire that comes and that just dominates forever, and even now it's the dominant empire, and then it never falls because it just keeps out all the outsiders. So let me break down what I think are some stages of empires. So stage one, I'll call it chaos, but I'm really referring to the stage before an empire is founded, where it's not really an empire yet, it's just a bunch of guys, living in the mountains or something. So I think that this stage, the world that gives way to the large empires, it's meritocratic, it's more unregulated. There are more competitors, but no single entities that dominate. So it's unstable and organized compared to how the empire will become. It will eventually become way more organized, way more stabilized, way more calcified. Now, there are obvious exceptions. There are cultural factors that make some empires more meritocratic anyway, or less meritocratic anyway. But viewed in terms of the early stage of an empire and the later stage of an empire, you can disagree, but I think this is a general pattern. So a concept that I'm thinking in terms of, I'm going to call rule rigidity. And rule rigidity means that you have very specific rules that are very strictly enforced. And so an example of a country that has very low rule rigidity from the contemporary times, although this is changing, but it used to be China. China, they had very ambiguous rules and rules that were very selectively enforced. And this was actually a big problem. This is not a good thing, because this was one of the reasons it was hard to do business there, because it's hard to do business if you don't know what the rules are, so you don't know when you're breaking them and when you're not breaking them. So this is perhaps contrary to your understanding of China, and of course it's changing with the social credit score and AI and a lot of things. But I think one of the reasons it might be most contrary to your understanding is because in a lot of ways they actually have very strict rules. That is to say, they have very targeted crackdowns, so it's a quite bipolar system. On the one hand, on the street level, on the ground, you have a lot of freedom, more freedom than in other places, and it's a lot more chaotic. But then in other ways, when they get hints that you're challenging the government, then they really care about you, and they do very targeted crackdowns in some very odd ways. So it's a kind of bipolar system. In ecology, there's this concept, I don't know how well accepted it is, but it's this concept that in resource-rich environments, there's less diversity because some animals come to dominate, like certain phenotypes that are just optimal for the environment. They will use the resource richness of the environment to allow themselves to just dominate the environment. But however, in less resource rich environments, which is to say, like in mixed resource, like if you have no resources, then obviously you're not going to have any diversity. You're not going to have anyone. But in medium, the optimal thing for biodiversity is environments with just enough resources where it's competitive, because then you have lots of different animals and phenotypes occupying different niches, and no one can dominate because the resources are too scarce. That when some species it gets too big, then there's not enough resources in the environment to sustain it. So it allows for constant flux in terms of what diversity is present, and that's what you want for biodiversity. So I'm kind of borrowing from that concept. Stage 2 is Ryzen Domination. So what I'm showing here is Warring States period. And so this is the Warring States period itself is actually more the stage 1 of chaos. But what happens eventually is that one kingdom will come and dominate and control a region. So one of the kingdoms within the Warring States period, it will dominate Japan and dominate China and dominate its area of Europe like Greece or what have you. And that is really what I mean by meritocratic. In terms of, from stage 1, it's meritocratic which of the kingdoms win. Now, there's obviously a lot of luck involved too, but more or less, since there's so much competition, the one that's going to win, you're not going to win totally by accident. You're probably going to win because you had some strategic advantage over the competitors. If you were a totally incompetent kingdom, then there was no way you were going to win the Warring States period. And so the rise, you can talk about it in terms of consolidation. But then an interesting thing starts to happen when people start to accumulate wealth, and that is they become elites. And then these elites will exert influence over the civilization. So, stage 3, and there are multiple aspects to this that happen concurrently. The first aspect of this I'm going to call change aversion or elite influence. And so what happens is, when you're so high up, the only direction to go is down. When you're at the top of the food chain and everyone around you seems lesser, then you want to not have things change that much because it maintains your position. So one of the horrible ironies is that people with the most power also have the most ability to affect change. But it's almost a tautology, right? The people with the most power have the most power to affect things, but it's also the case that to the extent that someone benefits from the way things are, they will be averse to change because any change threatens the way things are. And if you want things the way things are, then you support it. You support the status quo. So you won't want things to be shaken up because who knows, you might come down. But if you're already at the top, then you want things to change as little as possible. So I think it's very tautological. Now, the notion that elites have a vested interest here in the status quo is hardly a new idea. But what may be kind of original in how I'm describing it is this distinction between the early culture and the late culture, where in the later culture you have a higher concentration of elites, which is to say elites have managed to cement their control. Because in the early stage, chaotic culture, people have not accumulated enough success yet to really stand out as compared to anyone else. But in the later culture, these stakeholders have accumulated and they have success, they have power, and consequently they are able to exert their rule rigidity. And so, although the progress has been achieved, it comes at the cost of halted change. Maybe you want to maintain things how they are, maybe you want to maintain your progress, but in the cases where you need to change, you will be less able to do that. Now, to be clear, when I talk about change, there's a big debate between traditionalism versus, technology, but that's not really what I'm talking about here. In fact, it's conceivable that the change that you want is change in favor of traditionalism. Like, if the people who are at the top, if what helps them is this continuous churn in terms of more and more technology, and the opposite of that is traditionalism that, like, the non-elites favor, then the change, it doesn't mean change as in just isolated change. It means change in just the way things function, the way things run. And maybe you want is the way things run to be more traditionalist. But you can't even change to be that. You can't change to see, I want to be more traditionalist, I want to be more progressive, I want to be more technological. You don't have any ability to just let the best ideas win out, because a particular set of people have been able to cement their vision of how they want things to progress. So the next aspect of the change-averse culture I'm calling the status quo bias. At some phase, most people will not even be aware of their change-averse attitude, because these attitudes have so deeply permeated the culture, they don't even know about it. So one example of this mindset, I guess, is over-concern for volatility. So if you're change-averse and risk-averse, you don't like volatility because volatility is change. It could shake things up and mess things up for you. So if you're in this mindset, you're really scared of that. So you may take measures which kind of protect against volatility. So one thing that protects against volatility, or not protects against it, but mitigates it, is redundancy. So if you have redundancy, like let's say you have 2 employees to do the same job, then in case there's a rapid spike, a rapid volatile increase in the amount of work to be done, then it's less of a problem for you because you have the redundancy. It's not redundancy anymore, you have the employees to take care of it. But the problem is most of the time when you don't have that spike in the rapid twice as much work to do, then you have that redundancy where essentially it's less efficient. You have more people doing less work. And you're okay with that because it helps you mitigate those spikes. But that is the result of, you should have redundancy a little bit, but the more concerned you are about volatility, the more you will take measures like that, which result in a lot of inefficiency in the short term, but help you maintain your position over the long term. And so the culture will be more and more trying to maintain its position. If you want to say that this might explain the permeation of seemingly useless jobs in the developed economy, well, fine, yeah, that can be an argument. Now, one point about the term elites. When I say elites, I understand that's a relative term, or at least it sounds like a relative term. You're elite relative to someone else. However, that need not necessarily be the case in terms of elites, how I'm talking about it. Like what I care about is not being elite relative to other people. What I care about is being in such a good position that you don't want things to change. So it's theoretically possible where you have a big middle class, and for most people in the middle class, they have things pretty well off. And so it could be that the entire middle class, the term elite in this context would apply to them, even though it technically wouldn't be true in other contexts. But what I care about for this framing is how change-averse are you? And if the whole middle class, they have things relatively well off, well then I guess they are elites in terms of they have things well off, and so they too are averse to change. Okay, now let's talk about regulations. So an example of common regulations that might come to mind are regulations around how to build elevators, right? I haven't looked that deeply into this, but I imagine there are a million regulations that govern exactly the way elevators are allowed to operate, exactly how quickly the doors need to close, exactly how you need to make the doors, how big they need to be, the kinds of disability requirements there need to be, how quickly the elevators go up and down the floors, how many cables there are that connect the elevator to the ceiling, because there's not one, there's like 4. Every single detail about the design of elevators, I bet you there are regulations that govern it. Now, you might think, oh, this is a great thing. I feel so safe because elevators, they're so regulated that I know that I'm not just going to walk into a ragtag elevator made by some idiot engineer or architect that's just going to kill me. Okay, I'm sure that some lives have been saved because of elevator regulations, but there's also a cost to that we need to recognize, which is that insofar as those regulations are very specific about exactly how elevators need to be built, that means that if you try to create a really radically different kind of elevator that doesn't match any of the specifications of existing elevators, it could be way better, it could be way faster, way safer, but just because it doesn't match the existing specifications, then it wouldn't be allowed. So another example of regulations is on pill bottles. So pill bottles, they all look like that way for a very specific reason. And it's not because that's the optimal way to make pill bottles. Because if you think about it, to have a round cylindrical bottle like that with all of the details and ingredients on the side in that weird format, that's actually a really suboptimal way to make pill bottles. You could design them that are way better, way easier to read. A lot of old people can't read them that well because of just how they're made. Now, people have invented better designs for pill bottles, way better, but those designs are not allowed and have never been adopted because, and this is why, obviously, the medical industry is the most resistant to change out of almost any other industry. The medical industry, like for something like pill bottles, no one cares enough to even fight for it. It's not something exciting like anti-aging technology or something like that. It's just something mundane where the pharmaceutical companies want to follow the rules to a T because they know what happens if they don't. It takes $1 billion to get a drug through the FDA. So that's an example of just how overregulated the medical industry is. The computer industry, not so regulated. And also, the computer industry is the industry that has pretty much driven the growth of the economy over the last few decades. Another example of regulations is in energy generation, right? So there was once a time where we burnt whale oil, right? That wasn't so good. Then we switched over to burning gas. Now that was way better. And because of gas, basically it led to a huge growth in the economy, a huge flourishing of things that otherwise never would have been able to flourish because of the genius of burning gas. It was excellent for human well-being, right? But there are some problems with gas. It's maybe not the best for the environment if you care about that. But what happens now is we're really in the worst of all worlds. We could go with a replacement. We could go with nuclear energy, right? But we can't because basically nuclear energy is regulated out of existence. Do you know there's something called a paper reactor? What is a paper reactor? Well, a paper reactor means that you secured the paperwork to build a reactor. You have the land, you have all the necessary permissions to build a reactor. So you haven't actually started construction, you haven't started building at all, but at least you can build it. And getting a paper reactor, in some cases, can be more expensive than actually building the reactor. And that to me is just perverse. It's perverse that the actual work going into creating something is viewed as secondary to even being allowed to do it. It's perverse to me that even if it's not more expensive, that it can cost billions of dollars to secure this paper reactor. And yes, I understand that you want some regulation maybe because of all the nuclear disasters. Well, actually, if you think about it, nuclear energy is really safe statistically. A lot fewer people. I don't want to hear about Chernobyl. You know how many people have died in Chernobyl compared to all of the other sources of energy? Well, I'm not going to go on and on and on and on and about nuclear, right? But we can't have nuclear. Why? Well, both sides of the political spectrum don't really support nuclear. Like on the right, people don't really care that much about the environment compared to, I understand that sounds biased, but they like oil and gas, right? They like the conventional sources of energy, and anything that opposes that, they're going to say, well, why are we funding this? What's the point? Just keep going with oil and gas, right? But then people on the left, they're hyper rule fixated. They are obsessed with regulation, and what they want is clean energy like wind and solar. That's what they don't like nuclear for some reason. They like wind and solar. Only problem is wind and solar would cost billions of dollars, maybe over $1 trillion to replace all the oil and gas with wind and solar, and the right would never agree with that, right? So we have the worst of all worlds because if the right had its way, maybe we would have less of the regulation pandering and we could just adopt nuclear because it is the best cost efficient. But if the left had its way, then we could bankrupt the country getting wind and solar, and yeah, it would cost a hecton, but at least we would have some technological changes. But neither side wants to compromise, so we can't get nuclear. So picture this, right? Picture this in terms of the civilizational cycle that I'm describing. Phase 1 is an innovation is born out of the chaos phase. Innovations that are, for a time, in order of magnitude better than anything else that exists. Number 2, when the innovation takes root in the culture, an industry of people forms around it to support it and profit from it. So there are millions of people who profit off of, the way the medical industry works. Millions of people who profit out of the way buildings are currently built. Millions of people who profit out of the way, oil and gas. So millions upon millions, maybe hundreds of millions for each of these things. So number 3 is these people become the established interests and will be resistant to any new innovation that will make the existing technology defunct, because obviously it's their livelihood, the existing technology, so they don't want it to change. They would have to relearn new skills, a whole new industry. So these established interests work in subtle ways out of self-preservation, maybe not even that they know that they're doing it, but they just are looking out for their own best interests, and they make sure that innovation is impossible. And the result, number 4, is that we are stuck with long outdated technologies that are suboptimal compared to what we are capable of. And you know that you're in this stage when the implementation of the technology becomes the biggest hurdle, not its actual development. One thing I haven't talked about is cars. So this is an example. So phase 1 might be the horse and buggy, right? Phase 2 is that you invent the car and it's way better than the horse and buggy. And lots of people get very rich on the car. Henry Ford gets very rich building cars, right? Stage 3 is now you have a whole industry of people who make money selling cars. And it works in very subtle ways. It's not just the fact that people who make cars want to keep making cars. It's the fact that everything around the whole country has been basically engineered around the car. So it's not just the car itself, it's all of the infrastructure, all of the roads, all of the parking lots, everything that we have built, which assumes the use of the car. I don't want to say anything about stage 4 because I don't know what would be way superior than the car. Actually, I'll come back to this topic later. But I don't want to say that I have in mind this technology that is way better than the car. My only claim is that if there was such a thing, I think it would be hard to take off just because it wouldn't be accommodated by the way cities are built now and the way industries work and the way the whole economy functions around the car. The current system basically is biased against anything that's different than what currently exists. Regulations, they constrain the type of product you can build, and libertarians are right about this. This is one of the things that just libertarians are the most right about. I'll come back to medical. Because of medical regulations, fax machines still exist. Did you know that fax machines, they have not gone extinct? There are still many, many, many fax machines all over the country. Why is that? Well, I'll tell you why. Because at one point in the past, when fax machines were the leading technology, someone wrote into some now antiquated law that every medical record of such and such type needs to be recorded on a fax machine. And it made sense at the time because fax machines were the dominant way of recording information. But the problem is the person didn't think abstractly enough. They should have thought, it needs to be an official record or something. They should have thought in the terms of that. They shouldn't have thought in terms of any specific technology. Because if you write down a specific technology, like it needs to be recorded with a fax machine, you can't move past that specific technology. And you can think, well, when the technology progresses, just rewrite the regulations, rewrite the rules, and have them keep up and have them updated to be in pace with the new thing. And that might be possible if the regulations were written a little abstractly, like it needs to be an official record. Okay, that doesn't need to be a fax. But because the regulations recognize a specific technology, maybe we could update those regulations. Have we? Well, the proof is in the pudding, There are still many, many, many fax machines that exist. So obviously we haven't been able to update that. Maybe for some reason, people who sell fax machines don't want you to get rid of fax machines. Maybe that's why. Okay, so here it all comes together. You want regulations to be specific because then people know when they're in line with the rules, and that's very good. So I'm not saying regulations shouldn't be specific. However, the more the regulations reference the status of existing technologies, that's a ridiculous situation because you're constraining the field of what's possible. Regulations prevent mass defects, so are popular, but they prevent radical jumps on the adaptive landscape. It is more profitable to design around an existing technology blueprint than to author a radical redesign. And it's hard to jump the adaptive valley in this circumstance because you have this very particular zone that regulations allow you to exist in. And we know from earlier, in order to really make progress, you need to make radical changes, not just incremental changes. Regulations might be able to accommodate incremental changes because as you make the changes, the regulations change slowly at the pace of Washington. But in terms of radical changes, the regulations are counterproductive then. So what do we do when we see regulations that are counterproductive and you invent some new technology? Now the regulations are irrelevant because they cover ground that is no longer matters. Well, what do? Do you go back and rewrite and repeal those no longer useful rules? Well, rarely, because those who profit from the existing rules, they like the regulations just as they are. And those people, they make all of their profits selling the products that they do. And they don't want some newcomer to come around and pose opposition. They don't want an entrant into the market. They want those barriers to entry to prevent people from, just inventing new stuff and getting advantage through proprietary technology. So one analogy that I really like to describe this type of situation is a ratcheting effect. So an example of a ratcheting effect is a zip tie. A zip tie, you can only make it more tight. When you make it more tight, you can't make it less tight. You have to cut it, because a zip tie is only designed to move in one direction. It's only designed to get tighter. It's not designed to get looser. And so I think bureaucracy is an example of a ratcheting effect, because you can have more and more rules and regulations, but it's really hard to cut rules and regulations. It's the same thing, I think, with entitlements. It's easy to make more and more entitlements, but it's really hard to cut entitlements. In a large organization, the way that rules typically get created is that something goes wrong, and then people make rules to respond to that thing that goes wrong. It doesn't matter that the thing that goes wrong, it happened only once. People don't do cost-benefit analysis. Most people are terrible at cost-benefit analysis. So that thing that went wrong, they don't think in terms of, okay, what's the cost of always abiding by the regulation versus how often does it happen? The thing that went wrong, it just needs to be bad enough that people think to implement the regulation. So an example might be in a school, one kid, they use a swing, and then they hurt themselves on the swing, and then a parent gets upset, my kid hurt himself on the swing, and so they lobby the school to get rid of the swing, and the school happily complies because, they would rather keep that parent happy and just do this token gesture. They don't really care about how fun it is to use the swing. I mean, to even quantify that is just stupid and silly. It's much more safe to be safety first, right? But what happens, though, is that bureaucratic rules, they become basically a history of mistakes. This is what you call like bureaucratic scar tissue. And is that optimal? Is it optimal to have regulations be essentially a history book of mistakes? They're easy to create and very difficult to remove. That's why they're a ratcheting effect. And that's why the number of rules and laws and regulations, it's consistently growing. I mean, obviously there are exceptions. The only time of deregulation is immediately after a war. But the number of regulations that get created during the war, it makes it so that the total net result is more regulations because of the war. So you never truly get deregulation. You would need some big societal collapse to truly result in another chaotic phase. Regulatory capture. This is an example of status quo bias that we heard from earlier. Because the reality of regulations is much worse even than what I've described. Because you would be blown away by the gratuitous licensing requirements, copyright rules, hurdles to starting a business across industries. I mean, these things, they're known, but it's not known quite how bad they are. But here's the thing. It's a misconception to say that consumer protection rules originated from broad public demand. Who knows how many did, but in many cases, these rules were essentially written by the companies themselves, that the rules were written to apply to, because the regulators, they have this perverse dynamic. They don't want to anger the established players that much, because if you write rules that really make people go out of business, if those people are big enough, they can lobby to have those rules never come into place in the first place. So the real big regulations that would really hamper the bottom line of the biggest players in the industry, those never come up in the first place. The regulations that get passed are the kind of regulations where it really doesn't hurt the bottom line of the big players as they exist. However, the regulations do hurt the bottom line of people who are entering the market for two reasons. First, the people who are entering the market, they don't have the resources to afford the lawyers, to afford basically the massive costs of compliance. And furthermore, what we've already discussed, they have to abide by essentially the way of doing things. That is the way of doing things that has been perfected by the established players in the industry. And the big players, they have the economies to scale. They have the complex coordination. That is their barrier to entry that they primarily operate on, other than the regulatory capture. And the regulatory capture enhances that. They can rely on the economies of scale that allow them to afford the cost of administration to build these technologies that are not necessarily optimal, but it's what the regulations require. So where is the push to get rid of the regulations? This is why regulations are so hard to get rid of, because most people don't care enough to get rid of regulations. Most people think they're protective, they protect the consumer, and the big players, the people who really have resources, they're not all that opposed to regulations in the first place. So you shouldn't think of it like there's a battle between government and corporations. There's no battle. There's commiseration. One concept that I've found to be very useful is the concept from Nassim Nicholas Taleb, which is the dictatorship of an intolerant minority. So an intolerant minority means, let's imagine that you have a TV program and there's one wine mom who calls in and says, one Karen who says, I don't like what was shown on the TV program. And then, the producers of the TV program, they have to listen to the complaint. That's an intolerant minority, right? And in that case, the minority might not have that much sway. However, the insight of Taleb is that in a lot of cases, these intolerant minorities, which doesn't mean like racial minority, it just means anyone in minority of thought, like minority of opinion, they can exert disproportionate influence. So, is it a good thing to be an intolerant intellectual minority? Actually, I myself am quite a fan of intellectual minorities, and know that if you are the intellectual minority, well, I suppose you can use this intolerance to your advantage. But there are some perverse dynamics, I guess, you should be aware of in terms of when a large group needs to accommodate many different types of people. And Taleb, his insight is that these intolerant minorities, they control disproportionate influence because of asymmetry. And the asymmetry is that the minority, they care a lot about their issue, whereas the general population, they might not care that much about the issue at all. And so, because of that asymmetry, it's the path of least resistance to just appease the minority, because they're going to scream and yell and you just don't want to listen to them. So you just appease them just so you have to put up with them, and nobody else cares. There's no one on the other side, despite the fact that there's a larger number of people. In cases where the thing being argued about is maybe something relatively trivial, like the ingredients that go into some sort of drink or something like that, or some dietary requirements, something where most people, it's a matter of taste and they might prefer one way or the other, but they're not willing to take up arms about it. In that case, the group that is just so intolerant that they have to get their way, they can end up finding themselves in a situation where, on a whole range of issues, everyone essentially has to accommodate those people, to the point where it's essentially every choice that's accommodating to that, despite the fact that the vast majority of people don't care. And you can think, in a larger group, there's a higher number of people, and so the chance that one of them is going to not like what is happening or misinterpret what's happening, like let's say you say something, and you say something, you're in a comedy club, and the comedian says something to an audience of 100. Well, the chance that there's someone who doesn't like it exists, but let's say he says the same thing to an audience of 10,000, right? What are the chances that someone's not going to like it? Well, there's more people, so it's much higher. Now, let's say you're on Twitter and you say it to an audience of millions. Even if you say something in the clearest way possible, there's enough people that someone's going to misinterpret it, right? The more people to please, the more politically incorrect you have to be. So maybe larger outlets, movies with a higher budget, they have to be more politically correct because there are more people that they have to please. And you can also think maybe a civilization. It has more people, it has more minorities to please. So a similar dynamic, it's at play with companies. Let's say you're in a small startup. Let's say it's only you. The only person you have to get your approval is you. Now let's say you're in a startup of 100 people. Well, maybe you have to get your boss's approval, but then the company can move that direction immediately after that. And so it's easy for a decision to get approval. But with a larger corporation, by contrast, there are more and more levels of approval that you need to get through. Because, there's a hierarchy in any corporation. let's say there's a CEO, and then there's 8 people under the CEO, and each person under the CEO, they have 8 employees, and then each of them, they have 8 employees. And so if you trace the chain in the org chart, if you trace the tree, you're probably 6+ clicks away from the CEO, whereas at a startup, you're fewer clicks away from the CEO. So if you need to make a decision that requires the approval of the whole company needs to move in that direction. This is like the codification of the herd mindset that I was discussing earlier, the flocking mentality. Because let's say someone proposes something. You need to get approval from like 10 different people before that proposal can come through. You need to show it to your boss needs to show it to your boss's boss, and your boss's boss needs to show it to his boss, and you need to go through multiple levels. And what matters is not so much how much each person likes the proposal. What matters is whether or not one of them is going to hate it so much that they're going to fight it. So you're looking not to get something that everyone is going to love. You're looking for something that no one is going to absolutely hate to the point where they're going to fight against it. So it's not about how many people like you, it's about how many people don't like you. So here's a game of probability that helps me think about this. Let's say in one version of the game, you roll 6 dice all at once, and you win if the sum of the dice adds up to a certain amount. Let's say if it adds up to more than 13, you win, otherwise you lose, just some arbitrary number. That's one situation. But another version of the game is, you don't roll the dice all at once, you roll them one at a time. And in any situation, if one of the dice rolls comes up as a 1, you lose. And so that's the situation of ensemble probability, where you're not trying to maximize how much you get. You're trying to avoid the worst possible situation in each iteration. And this is an insight of Taleb too. It's the difference between ensemble probability versus, concurrent probability in this dice roll analogy. And obviously dice rolls are random, but let's say there was some non-random component. The second game would produce very different results from an incentive standpoint than the first game. 2 things that are the most common culprits in the please-all culture to prevent people from being upset and to get things shut down and to create rules against things. There are 2 common culprits that are pity and safety. And I think these are 2 of the most overrated things in the Western world. Now, you might think it's a good thing that these are so highly rated. I mean, if anything is going to be overrated, it's better that your culture highly rates things such as pity and safety versus it highly rates other things that could be detrimental. Maybe it's the sign of the height of civilization that it is capable of erring on the side of pity and safety rather than the opposite, which would be worse. But that doesn't change the fact that these 2 things are overrated. So here's an example of what I mean. A while ago in the UK, I think, there was this initiative to build what are called shared spaces, which, let me just briefly explain the concept. The concept is, with urban design and street design and urban planning, which is a topic I'm kind of interested in. I'm interested in removing rules, I guess, from urban planning. And one thing that works surprisingly well is removing street signs, removing markings, removing lines on the roads, making things more freeform, and blurring the line between the sidewalk and the street, and blurring the line between the street and everything else. And you might think, if you don't keep the cars in line, then they're just going to run roughshod and crash into everyone. Well, research on this topic it shows the opposite. It shows that when you remove rules from urban street design, then 2 things happen. First, the cars drive more safely, and second, the people behave more safely. And the result is actually fewer accidents, and also higher walkability of the streets, which is a big, interesting political issue that I'm interested in. I think that shared spaces might be a very interesting idea that should be rolled out. However, there's one thing that happened in the UK when they started to roll out more and more of these so-called shared spaces. And that is that a disabled person, they were hit by a car and they died, and then their family became huge lobbyists to oppose the creation of more shared spaces. They said, if only they hadn't have done this horrible street design, my disabled son would have lived. Is this true? Well, it's questionable. Maybe according to the actual studies that have been done on this, according to the actual statistics, no, it's safer to be in a shared space. But maybe it's an exception. Maybe the situation is different for disabled people, and for them, shared spaces actually is slightly worse. Now, I highly doubt this, but it seems credible to a lot of people because it plays on these ideas of pity and safety. But safety, oh, the person was unsafe. Safety centers activate, And pity, oh, it's a disabled person. How sad. We should be able to accommodate those people. So then what happened was the narrative was so gripping that, quote, a 2015 House of Lords shared space report called for a temporary ban on shared space designs and asked to put all shared space schemes on hold until they improve the process of consulting disabled communities. So translation, shared spaces are banned from the UK permanently, or at least until the disabled community, whatever that is completely happy with the idea and approves every single design, which is never, because they were explicitly chosen for being the group that most dislikes this whole concept, which I'm not obsessed with. I don't think this is the best idea in the world, but it's a good example of how a very small, isolated interest group can affect massive change. And you might even be mad at me for saying this. You might think, well, yeah, disabled people should have that much influence. Society should accommodate everyone. But you know what? I think at some point it's a good idea to use cost-benefit calculation. Is the benefit actually worth the harm? Or should we just choose the people that we know from prior experience, historically, are most likely to oppose the initiative? And should we get their approval first and rely on them to decide, bar none, whether the initiative should go forward? Like deciding on the legality of, I don't know, jeans based on the anti-jean pants lobby. I mean, that's a moronic idea. But it seemed okay in this situation, just under the banner of pity and safety, and that's what I mean. An idea that's a generally good idea can be completely shut down just because of one concern that could perhaps be addressed, but people just try to build it up in such a big thing that to think it could never be addressed. And that's how basically we never get any productive changes and never get rid of the status quo that's harmful. This brings us to the final stage of my whole paradigm of civilizations, and that is what I'm calling sick man, after the famous sick man of Europe. And that is that everyone is on a local maximum of the adaptive valley. Everyone is here. Everyone is at a peak, but not the highest peak. So civilization has reached the status where progress is essentially a negative feedback loop, which is to say that change aversion halts future progress. What you have essentially is a roaming oligarchy. So what I'm suggesting is that civilization always chases higher and higher peaks on the adaptive valley, more opportunities for growth. And the established players eventually become oligarchies, which makes them more stagnant than they could otherwise be, whereas the smaller, more agile and bold civilizations can rise from the outskirts, can come down from the mountains and take power because they can just outcompete everyone else. But we will not be able to always get better. That's perhaps Whig history. Civilizations can decline. Some sources of decline. Stagnation creates a lot of problems because when you have positive sum growth, it allows for politics relatively free of conflict. We are always seeking growth as a civilization. And if positive sum growth doesn't work, then people will look for other opportunities for growth. And so when consensus-based politics breaks down, then we can return to factionalism and identity politics, where essentially you get resources by taking them away from some other group, as opposed to building up resources in a positive sum way. And as we've already gone over also, a lot of programs have a Ponzi scheme like nature. Like I already discussed Social Security and immigration. So Social Security is essentially a Ponzi scheme because it's a transfer program from the young to the old. So that's a particularly strong example, but there are also many other more subtle examples, situations of Ponzi schemes that work themselves into universities and corporations and every type of organization. There is some sort of implicit premise of future growth that the up-and-comers are relying upon. And furthermore, the adaptive landscape is not stagnant. This is another variable. The adaptive landscape is not one adaptive landscape. It changes and morphs. It's essentially the environment. As the environment changes and morphs, the adaptive landscape morphs to model it. And so the whole landscape can basically shift under your feet, and you need to be able to adjust for it. And a change of our civilization will not be able to change fast enough to be able to adjust. Any unpredictable thing can jeopardize the balance. The civilization stability becomes its fragility because it is not agile enough to bounce back. This is another Taleb concept, the concept of anti-fragility. You need to actually be able to be a little bit unstable in order to move fast enough to be able to account for the inherent instability of the world as it shifts under your feet. And another concept that the left likes to bang on about is inequality, how the rich get richer. That's a thing. And in practice, it turns out to be actually generally correct. Generally, resources do accumulate to a smaller and smaller number of hands, and there are exceptions, but those exceptions tend to be calamities: war, revolution, state collapse, plagues. There's a book called The Great Leveler: Violence and the History of Inequality from the Stone Age to the 21st Century. And that's essentially the premise of the book. It alleges that the only things that increase equality and decrease inequality are those chaotic situations, that chaos phase, the violence and the state collapse, revolution, war, plagues, those kinds of things. There is also one more exception to everything I've been talking about, and that is war. Because war creates a level of desperation to galvanize the competition and experimentation to find novel solutions. People get so desperate, they start inventing new things, and they don't give a crap. They just do what they have to do to win. They don't care about who is appeasing who, the internal politics. That factors in somewhat, but at the end of the day, they need to win the war so they don't die. So war has a very galvanizing effect. And that's maybe the reason why the world wars were such a bastion of invention. I'm even including the Cold War in this. I think the space race was an example of innovation insofar as the Cold War could beget innovation. And there you go. I've been thinking about all of this in terms of the adaptive landscape as a very interesting model, but I've been thinking in terms of a lot of other models to help explain the details. And the things I've been trying to explain are the three big things. It's a model for social issues, a model for political issues, and a model for personal how to achieve success issues. And that's all for now. So I hope that you found it helpful, or at very least you found certain sections or certain parts of it able to enhance your perspective and think of things in ways that you maybe hadn't thought of before. So that's all.